So just a few quick words of introduction to the next panel, which is in theory about the future. Of course, as you know, the future is actually not what happens tomorrow, but future is something that happens now. Future is what you think now about what might happen, and it's not possible to think now about what might happen without thinking about the past. So, of course, this sort of separation between the past and the future is not the case. And in fact, I think Andrew Dolkart would insist that, and does insist that, the Historic Preservation Program is the only truly future-thinking program in the school, because they launch buildings 100 years into the future, whereas the rest of the school just thinks about the next 10, 15, 25 years. So maybe it's appropriate to begin the session on the future with an email sent by Jim Polshek yesterday. He just says in capital letters with lots of exclamation marks, "Happy birthday, Avery Hall 2012, a leap year in which Ray Eames and Yamasaki were born and Daniel Burnham and Frank Furness died. Fenway Park opened and the Titanic closed. Tarzan appeared and the Piltan Man was declared a hoax. There is no end to the Wikipedia experience, but there was an end in 1987 to my 15-year occupancy of the southeast corner of the second floor of Avery Hall." So now it's the second floor again. "They were stimulating years, chaotic as we emerged from the revolution, but calm and colourful thereafter. Ken Frampton, Mary McLeod, Richard Plunce, Klaus Herdig, and dozens of others gave the building a real pulse and revived its mission. Lou Schiller and David Hinkle made it all work. I was proud to have been a small part of Avery's illustrious 100-year history. Very sincerely yours." And this comes after an apology for the fact that he's on another planet, another country. So just to quickly introduce the panel, first Carole and Fabian, who's now the Avery librarian. And I remember very well the moment of hiring Carole, because there were two candidates actually, and in a way they represented what might be a future Avery librarian, a woman completely associated not just with libraries in the classical sense, but with with art store and the nature of digital images and so on, and somebody who I can see visually very, very well, that would perfectly maintain the kind of sort of image of a library, the image that we were all drawn to. All of us, in a certain sense, were drawn to Columbia in that way. I, for example, was teaching in New Zealand and persuaded the dean of the school where I was teaching that I needed study leave to go to the Avery Library to be in the archives for 6 months, which I did in 1985. So we were all, as it were, drawn into a library. But in being drawn into that library, became part or entered into the spirit of the experimental school that was attached to that library. So, of course, the vote for Carole as Avery librarian was an attempt to sort of embrace immediately the fact that if Avery would remain that library that would draw everybody from around the world, it would do so by being to the digital age what the library had always been to the other age. In other words, and this was not understood as a sort of contradiction. If it was that Avery is sort of synonymous with the depth of the archive, and the sense that the archive is not a mortuary, but is actually the place in which the future is incubated, that precisely you gather the thoughts of the past in order to throw yourself into the future, then, of course, it would be Avery that would have to first understand in which way the digital world is a world of new kinds of archives and new kinds of thoughts, and therefore new kinds of leaps into the future. So we were really thrilled that Carole joined us here and is really doing exactly that. And so it will be wonderful to start the session on the future with Carole. And then will be Bernard Tschumi, because it's just the school is unimaginable outside of that. Maybe it was also 15 years or so after Jim Polshek, in which an extraordinary model of how the school would honor the mandate of William Ware was developed, whereby sort of a genuinely global environment for experimentation was launched, of which I personally believe only one of the significant experiments was the digital one, but perhaps the one that of course received the most attention perhaps, but actually there was a much deeper and more wide-ranging transformation of the school occurred. And also to thank Bernard personally, because in every way he's been an extraordinary mentor and guide for me, and in my own mind I just feel like somebody gave me the keys to a very good restaurant, and it was just a matter of making sure the kitchen, maintained the quality. So, and again, I think that Bernard probably could speak more eloquently about the future than I can, the last of the three speakers, who surely knows the least about both the past, the present, and the future, because one of the, of course, interesting things about being in this particular position is you see almost nothing, as one does in the middle of a storm. There is a sort of quiet spot right there in the middle of the vortex, in which is also, I would say, a blind spot. And it could be argued that it is the blindness of deans to the real consequences of their decisions that actually allows them to make the decisions in the first place. So it's not so bad, this thought, that you don't really know what's going on, and as such, you lose a sort of ethical restraint that you might otherwise have, and you simply, as it were, launch. And the more you do that, the more there is a storm, and therefore the less you see. So having been doing this for about 10 years, I'm about as blind as you could possibly be. So the champagne will be somewhat urgently needed after you've heard from me. But first, Carole.
Thank you, Mark, for your very kind remarks. And I must say it's rather humbling to join Avery Hall and Avery Library and GSAPP on the heels of so much distinction that precedes me in the last 100 years. I also wanted to thank today Gavin Browning and Paul Dallas for their wonderful efforts in bringing this event together and this happy celebration, and all of you for spending your Saturday with us to wish Avery a very happy birthday. If you haven't yet, when we go out to Champaign, I'll remind you, one of the graduate students here, I think a few of them actually, Jihoi Lee and Eduardo Rega Calvo, produced for us a wonderful exhibition on the landing between oh gosh, what level is it? 200 and 300 or 100 and 200, something like that. But as you exit today, you'll see a wonderful exhibition by them. I hope you enjoy it. So for me, Avery Library is, as many academic libraries and architectural libraries as well, equal parts committed to its past, its present, and the future, which it can barely see, but has to imagine and design for. Library organizations live very actively and persistently in the full range of activities that inform building program over time and engages each of those past, present, and future characteristics. And rather than a fixed purpose, I would say, the work that we do, the collections that we build are all responsible to the architectural research and practice that occurs in the floors above us and in the world around us, and into the probably most focally for us, the evolving needs of the constituency that we serve. Our familiar historical formats, the solutions for those we well understand, and they're part of our ongoing practice daily. But our current data-intensive digital universe of formats for knowledge creation and transfer present very, very different dimensions of complexity for libraries, for archives staff, and for users alike. So while all disciplines are engaging in this issue at this moment, the added and particular challenge for art and architecture collections is the movement to digital. It's both at warp speed, as you see happening in the swirl upstairs, and also at a snail's pace at the same time for the enormous analog to digital transition that we are all trying to understand. So what I thought I would do today, rather than try to give you a roadmap for what Avery is going to do in the next century, but on this first day of its second century, take a little lens of the various numbers of activities that we engage in, do that through a series of images that sort of show you the arc of transformation from our history, as Mark said, through a present that's constantly changing and looks forward to what our challenges are going forward. Find this. Here we go. So, we've looked a lot today at pictures of Avery as it was envisioned by the first designers, but over time it has responded to the demands of an expanding literature and a demanding set of users by a series of renovations. And these three images represent what we've seen in, Sam actually had to step out, but Sam White oversaw the renovation of the 200-level original reading room. The second picture is the 200-level Kuzmanov addition that goes under the courtyard. And then the third, which we've not spoken of yet today, is the Wallach addition, which opened in 2003 and now houses the Office of Art Properties and the Department of Drawings and Archives, where we have drawn many of the images today. We hope that the Avery's second century will include the next, more than overdue, best version of a program for our space as it exists today. Our collecting is broad. Avery is well known worldwide for its renowned collections, both for their breadth and depth of coverage. The literature of architecture in particular is exhaustively covered from the Renaissance to the present day. In sheets, in volumes, in serials, microformats, digitized and born digital e-formats comprise the library as it stands, with more than 550,000 print volumes alone. This year we calculated holdings of nearly 30,000 e-books in architecture, and that is compared to none 6 years ago at the time of the last NAAB review. We in the library are certainly committed to collecting and preserving the physical record as we've all known it and enjoyed for all of its complexity, but now we look very much to the digital and all its unknowns. In curating, it's the particular joy and reward for working in Avery that you get to curate the works, the corpora of the masters of architecture from all times. From the exquisite and unique works created by Piranesi, our collection of the Sackler Piraneses in particular are incredibly beautiful. We host a Piranesi Day every fall where we welcome the school to come and see these treasures. Most recently, we engaged in a partnership with MoMA to jointly acquire the massive, vast, and astounding works by Frank Lloyd Wright and his full archive, which will be coming to Avery Hall this year, and we hope will be open to all of you to enjoy as soon as next fall in incremental releases. But the greater challenge is the record of the 21st century in archives such as those created by Frank Gehry, where his sculptural method of creation gives way then to massive, truly massive, engineering files, CAD and BIM files, tied together not by bundles of drawings and strings, but by interactive platforms such as G-Team. Gehry's archive alone fills an industrial warehouse of about 25,000 square feet, and I can't even imagine how many terabytes of server space. The durable beauty of our paper-based past is giving way to an increasingly fugitive digital present and a questionable legacy for our future. Preserving these works, capturing and preserving the architectural record, the creative and intellectual works of the discipline, that's a sacred trust for Avery Library, one that we share with the community as stewards of your work. And here we see the very familiar rare antiquarian books that founded Avery Library, the complete crazy mix of formats that have occurred over the 20th century that present unbelievable problems for preservation, and currently a methodology, an approach to preserving the past through massive and rapid capture into digital formats. These formats help us to, in the digital world, capture things such as analog works. Some of these represent serial runs from 19th and early 20th century journals, major gifts to the collection. The Durst organization recently gave a major gift to the university benefiting the school, and Avery in large parts, the Old York Library collection, a wealth of information on New York City, the New York real estate brochure collection. If you know anything about New York, we love real estate. Everybody here, one of the big questions everyone's asked, you know, if you talk about food and you talk about real estate, that's what you do. Those are the first two sections you're going to open in the paper. Anyway, and then our unbelievably wonderful, whimsical ephemeral collections also, when these are captured in digital format, not only do they preserve these fragile items, but they make them much more accessible to a worldwide community of users. The archiving of those, both the physical and the digital, are theoretically archived in perpetuity once they enter the Avery collection. The digital, as I say, brings new challenges about persistence, such as systematic protocols for data migration, platform emulation, and protection from data loss and data corruption. These are not the problems of paper-based. With paper-based, we're worrying about worms and rot and mildew and things like that. But we know how to mediate a loss in those instances when they occur. For the digital, it is certainly not the case. Storage. We're very, very familiar with the challenges of scale. Andrew mentioned the size of Avery Library as first conceived, something like, where did you go, 50,000 volumes? And now I tell you we are more than 10 times that. Our Drawings and Archives Department comprises over 2 million works of architectural record in paper form. And those physical and digital assets bring new challenges, as I say, about how we're going to systematically prepare for those. As the storage needs grow, we move from off-the-shelf to warehoused volumes for the printed record, and to data storage in multiply redundant server rooms, repositories, where storage is expressed not in shelf linear feet or cubic feet, but in volumes of words unknown to most of us for the most of our lives, terabytes, now petabytes, exabytes, zettabytes, and the new one, yottabytes. I learned that one. So what do we do with all that stuff that we collect, try to take care of so well and preserve for the future? We provide a number of seeking mechanisms, and beginning first in our distant past with a ledger book of every work that came into the collection. 5 years into the library being founded in 1895, the first printed catalog, which lists all the books in the library and becomes the checklist for subsequent architectural libraries, certainly in America, as late as the founding of CCA. So, you know, something still not gone past. The card catalog you're all familiar with provided an item level, shareable way of investigating the collection. Next to online databases in the form of catalog records, and those kinds of discoveries from very discrete, personal, place-based things is now very much on the move as all of our online environments become discoverable via handheld devices. The habits of reading persist, but the way we do it is entirely different and I think increasingly unpredictable from our friends the librarians in the original Avery Library in Low. This common experience of every student who's in the room of camping out on our floors because we don't have enough seats for all the people who wish to use Avery. Reading is now in an electronic device and being imagined and actually used in some early prototype glasses for reading in full surround without in any place at any time. Imaging continues to be the constant, I would say, and the centrality of all that we do, both in the ways we create and the way we remember. The transition through time from the lantern slide to the 35 millimeter slide and now from into a digital universe where not only are we capturing firsthand two-dimensional digital things, but certainly immersive and three-dimensional QTVR files and other ways of knowing and seeing the built experience without actually being there. I would also encourage you, as an aside, the graduate school about a year and a half, 2 years ago, had a wonderful lantern slide exhibit, again in the landing on the way to Brownies, and they have the students in the Visual Center recently did an installation for Avery Library, which is permanent, and where we use the scanner room as the lantern to illuminate the lantern wall. So if you have time today, drop into the library on the 200 level to see the lantern wall installation. Our ways of seeing, our opportunities expand beyond what we can imagine. This is a picture of the lantern wall installation in Avery, and where we imagine we are, and in some places they are already there. Brown just launched a video wall similar to this, where you completely surround and immerse yourself in the visual, and you actually can interact with it via touchscreen technologies. And of course, still, the work of students and scholars continues every day in Avery Hall. It draws the community into its space, and it engages them with each other to a lesser or greater extent, and with our treasure trove of content. And you see, it was interesting thinking when we were seeing some of the historic images of the drawing tables and the way people were interacting in those spaces, and we heard about the sense of community that occurred in the 60s, certainly here on campus. And I happen to know and think that that way of working cross-platform with each other does happen. It just isn't as personal and direct. A lot of those people are talking to each other. They're just not doing it by their voice. And the method of creation is not just on the drawing pad, but certainly on the pad in front of them, the laptops. I heard from some of my colleagues that in its first iteration, Avery Library connected its users to the collection by virtue of a dumbwaiter. There was storage on the 100 level. The library reading room was on the 200 level, as was the librarian's office, and apparently this dumbwaiter went between the two, and that's how you got your, whatever wasn't in the reading room was recalled in that manner. Nowadays, the scale of collections and patron-driven appetite for research material is now at such a scale that geographically distributed collections are warehoused at a distance and shuttled to users via forklifts and courier services. This is the ReCap facility in Princeton, where we house a good deal of those books that we are not able to hold here. And increasingly, our resources are also connecting to our research through global networks that allow us to penetrate the constraints of our physical space. And innovating is a hallmark of Avery Library to its colleagues and peers in ways that are transparent to most of its users. Underlying the usability of any digital environment are the data constructs, the data exchange protocols, the technical infrastructures that engage and enable aggregation, discovery, dissemination of research content. Avery's projects continue to provide worldwide leadership in this arena. Our expert staff is engaged in a number of collaborative efforts that shape the landscape for digitally accessible content in the 21st century. These are 3 projects that have digital as their major component. This Aviador project, which was the first digitized, distributed effort for architectural renderings. The Avery Index, featuring our wonderful editor over the last 20 years, Ted Goodman, who's here with us today, still provides the central point of departure for architectural research. And our new project, which is a federally funded national leadership grant called the Built Works Registry, will for the first time give unique IDs, like ISBNs are to books, but unique IDs to built works, to geolocate them and describe them, and therefore serve as a data point that can be used in any other kind of representation. These projects parse data elements using nearly a genomic level of attribute. They enable both serendipitous and highly constructed connections in a cloud-based linked data environment. Those projects and everything we do in Avery and all that it contains and represents very much present a larger network of collaboration and integration. Our presence is well known in the world. It takes on a global scale by virtue of the work we are contributing to these efforts and because of the place where we work. Still, in its present form, Avery Hall is a locus for knowledge. It's a space dedicated to collecting the architectural record in all its forms. It's a place where users access and use the intellectual and creative works, the products of the architectural domain. And it's a place, I believe, that still nurtures a community of creative practice. It's done all this for us very well over the last century, and we look forward very much to the shape it'll take in serving us in the century to come. Thank you very much.
Can I have the light on? I don't have any slides. I don't have any slides, but I thought I would try with a series of cards. I never do it with cards, but I'll tell you why in a second. When you walked in, when you came here, you might have noticed a small exhibition which was not so small, which was just put up 2-3 days ago, which is what I would call, I don't know how you call them, Mark, the Studio X charts. Can we have the light on? I just don't, okay, I want to see you. Now, oh, you know things. Thanks, great. Great. Now, this is interesting for two reasons. On the one hand, is of course the content, which is the quite extraordinary project that Mark Wigley has been engaged in for a number of years now, and also for certain particularities of this building. I'll come back to Mark Wigley in a second, but let's talk about this building first. Nobody remarks on the fact that this building has a very strange architectural coherence. Right? You have that leftover space, which is that very important vestibule. It's at the bottom of, the elevator, and then it goes nowhere. It's a dead space. It's not the only dead space. There's another dead space as you go from when you enter the building on whatever level, it's called 300, and you move to something called 300 mezzanine, 300M. In other words, you leave the library and you go through this rather nasty staircase into a new entrance, which is the entrance of the School of Architecture. As if the architect had tried to negotiate a strange relationship between these two buildings. It's not an atrium, it's not something of great, architectural sort of monumentality. It's that small staircase that goes around the elevator. So here in these two awkward moments, you have that staircase that goes to the school and the staircase that comes to a major place, which is the auditorium. So in the lower one is this exhibition of the Studio X chart. Now, what I find interesting about it, and I will mention it because I'm sure Mark is too modest to bring it up, the current issue of Architecture magazine, or I think it's now, yeah, it's Architecture magazine, is dedicated to the future of schools of architecture. And in that particular issue that talks mostly about buildings, it has also a ranking of this particular school. Now, I'm pleased to tell you that with Mark Wigley, this school is now ranked number 2 in the US. Now, this is interesting because we know that nobody can get number 1, Because even if a school doesn't exist and you mention the name of that school with Harvard connected to it, it will get #1. So I'm pleased to see this because I was very proud that we got, in my time as a dean, the school as #3. So 1 up, good for you. Right. A couple other things about the building. It's very hard to transform it, but there was an interesting thing about it when I first came in. It was, the school was organized in divisions. There was the division of architecture, the division of planning, the division of preservation. And the division of this division had become absolutely physical. In other words, they were materialized. I will always say that architecture is the materialization of concepts. Here they had used cinder blocks to divide level 400 into 2 parts, one with the division of planning and the other one with the division of architecture. We turned those, we took those down. Another oddity of this particular building that I often tease some of my colleagues here teaching architecture to point out that the top floor, I know many of you in this audience must know it, that the 5th floor has no columns. That's the 6th floor is actually a suspended floor from the huge trusses above. So when you ask someone, how come this thing is so thin, this column, it's not a column, it's a suspended tie. So I prepared this morning, thinking the future of architecture. So I remembered Cedric Price, who would put these cards in a random order and sort of thing. So I thought I'd do the same thing if we talk about the future of architecture education. Now, the future, the thing is, I don't know whether we want to call it the future of the profession. I don't know what the profession is. I'm suspicious. But let's say the future of the activity that leads to architecture. Architects don't build, they draw. You may know that famous statement by Robin Evans telling us about the division of labor, which began literally in 1671 when Colbert, not the one that plays late at night, but the other one, the minister of Louis XIV, instituted the first school of architecture, the Académie Royale of Architecture. So at that moment, there was the first division. So this is quite important because maybe it tells us a lot about our education. Often we make the distinction between the Bauhaus and the Beaux-Arts, and it's quite important because it's a division between, say, the European means of teaching architecture versus an American one. Of course, when I say American one, I mean the Beaux-Arts. What happened, you may remember that while architects in Europe were trying to develop new means of buildings, architects in America did not have schools of architecture. Before this school and before MIT, they went to Rome, while the American construction industry, which was extremely proactive, was developing a series of construction methods that they called industry standards. The architect coming back from Rome then would have to obey the so-called industry standards, and generally it was done in that pink area that was called poché. So that explains that a very different type of education was taking place in 2 different cultures. Again, I'm not talking about France. France was like America, heavily drawn in the Beaux-Arts, as opposed to places like Germany or Switzerland. But it still explains a very interesting oddity. and this when we talk about architectural education, is that when you look at an architecture contract, a contract for building, those of you who build, you might see a very important difference in the fees that architects get for construction supervision or contract administration. Now, these two expressions are rather interesting. When a building is being built, a European architect is directing construction. An American architect is administrating contract, CA, contract administration. It means that the fee for building, for directing a building is 40% of the fee, while contract administration is 25% of the fee. The money is put elsewhere. So that's a different form of education, right? Now, if I make this distinction, is that what we discovered at the end of the 19th century as a difference has become now a much more, how could I say, institutionalized way of thinking. We distinguish today the design architect as opposed to the production architect. That's two different, increasingly two different professions. So what is the future of education? In the same way, in a more fashionable sense, if I think just very recently, we started to talk about fabrication, fabricators. The question, are architects fabricators? Or architects people who invent concepts and materialize them? So do we fabricate, or we do, or invent? Generalist versus specialist. Are we generalists who know a lot about very little? No, sorry, about who know very little about a lot? Or are we, specialists who know a lot about very small things? I have at a regular, interval that debate with my friend Wolf Briggs of Korpimmelau fame, who will always argue that we are specialists in generalities. In other words, that we are able to deal with a very large scope of very different issues and are able to make sense out of them. AIA, providing services or defining needs. What is the architect? Is he a service provider, or does he define needs? In my own architectural education, for example, I was taught how to build at DTH. I was taught how to read a program and do exactly what I was asked to. That's in Zurich. And then I went to teach at DA, and I was amazed that over there, the first thing they asked them was to design the program. In other words, to determine what the needs were, the needs of the user. And here we get back to Cedric Price. You all know the statement by now, as he is trying to help a couple to design a house for that couple, and they're so bickering that he tells them after 2 months, it's not a house you need, it's a divorce. He's defining needs. And another, always about the future of architecture. Power versus influence. What is the most important thing? In architectural history, if I think of Italy in the 70s, you have one man who had a lot of power. His name was Vittorio Garotti, and another man who had a lot of influence. His name was Aldo Rossi. It's not the same. in America is as if you would say David Child versus Danny Libeskin down in the World Trade Center. Another one, theory versus practice. Are they separate? Are they different? Now, this is an interesting one in relationship to this particular school, because for a long time, I was quite convinced that much of the history of the school could be explained through the strange relationship and rather aggressive relationship that William Ware and Charles McKim had with one another. The theorist, so-called, Ware, versus the practitioner, McKim. And when I first became dean, I spent a few enjoyable nights reading, starting in 1932, which is the first time that David Hinkle could trace them, the faculty minutes. And all of those faculty minutes were really about that battle between the history theory versus practice. To me, between William Ware legacy and Charles McKim. So it's always here. Another one, ideology versus discovery. Once upon a time, we had schools which were really believing in certain ways of thinking, the ideology of modernism, or the ideology of postmodernism, or the ideology of autonomy, as opposed to crossovers. Today, does it still exist? Not so much, or does it? We have the iconists versus, the conceptualists? Or is it the phenomenologists versus everybody else? There's another question. Computers versus the hand. I was amused to see a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, Michael Graves writing in the New York Times and regretting the time we were doing color rendering, drawing, pencil rendering. At the same time, I couldn't help thinking that his generation talked about rendering with pencil the way a painter would. My generation was more drawn to filmmakers, think of Rem Koolhaas or Jean Nouvel. So in other words, each generation carries their own modes of representation. What are the new mode of representation? It's not the computer. Computer is already, there. Another, this one. Yeah. Initials versus signatures. SOM, HOK, KPF, or Geary, Meyer, Hadid. That was true 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now it's a little more difficult. Big, B-I-G, he was lecturing here a couple of weeks ago. O-M-A, is it a signature or is it an initial? Has that distinction disappeared? Another one these days, which is starting to becoming more important, starchitects versus activists. Where does it take us? We have a fantastic institution in this place, which is called the Columbia Lottery. Every semester, you have, at the time I was Dean 12, now 22 or something like this, young faculty members, some of them are not that young, presenting in 7 to 10 minutes a composite reduction, in other words, a very concentrated lecture of what they believe in, and introduce the fact that much of what we teach is about differences, and that every one of those faculty members is competing with another faculty member in order to establish his own identity and its own difference. And maybe here it's something that has to do with that future. In other words, in no way something which is a homogeneous ideology. So that brings me to my last two cards. One is simply what is architecture? And those who know me have heard me say that many times. It's a discipline that invents concepts and materializes them. In other words, you have to start with some ideas. And the last card is really crucial. There's one particularity about this education, the education of an architect, is the project. We do it to a project. We don't do it to the past or to the present. We project ourselves into the future. And we use a number of means, a number of ways to do it. But it's that projection that makes us quite different from any other, I again hesitate to use the word profession. The word architect is quite a different way to read and to approach the world. Thank you.
So just to join the reflections about the future, which is a tricky thing to do, although I judge by the most recent elections that now the future can be really very precisely calculated. And at some level, I'm sure that logic will start to affect architecture, that is to say the use of massive data analysis to produce very precise images of desires and decisions. But it may be a mistake for us to assume that architecture has ever been in a very close relationship to needs and desires. We act as if that's the case, but it might be somewhat different. For me, it was wonderful to listen to Barry and Andrew and Janet and Sam, and then Michael, Tony, and Ken, Mary taking us through the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s. And then now we are, let's say, about to talk about the future. I think if we were to do an experiment and ask students that we admire, or faculty that we admire, or scholars that we admire, or professionals, what are the kind of key issues of the future of the field, I want to suggest that the answers that they would give would be exactly answers coming out of the 1960s. In other words, they would talk about ecology, technology, computation, social justice, resource management, activism of different kinds, but also kind of demographic transformation, enormous global transformation, and so on. All of these things which were incredibly vibrant during that very same period. And one can discuss backwards and forwards whether or not architecture schools during the 60s and 70s, how they handled those various issues, but those issues were more often than not named by the activist generation, a generation, of course, that got older and became the establishment in the time-honored manner. And then one can say, as they grew older, did those urgent issues transform architectural education in the way that was thought? And I think the answer is no. And a series of very, very major architectural debates emerged. And I would almost suggest that the big debates of the late 70s and 80s were almost, as it were, designed to render all of those topics of the 60s unmentionable and irrelevant. And not by accident, it seems to me, that over the last decade has been an enormous revival of interest in the architects of that period, the magazines of that period, the documents of that period, and so on. Because, of course, at a general level, we see played out on a world stage exactly the same set of issues. So once again comes up the question, now that architecture schools would once again say exactly again what they would have said in the 60s as the most urgent issues. where are we going to be? How will we stand up in the face of those issues? And of course, the major difference is that so many of those issues, as they were announced, were also following again Bernard's point, they were conceptual issues as well. It's not that the global demographic transformations were being experienced in the way they're being experienced now. They were being projected and considered. What was in the 60s a series of kind of projected questions that would galvanize and transform society in a moment in time in which transformation, even revolution, was the mandate. Many of those things, of course, have become, let's say, the real conditions of the world. For example, ecology is no longer a radical commitment by a young architecture student or a politically or technologically motivated architect to sort of honor the equal distribution of resources through being intelligent about energy. It's now the law. If you don't do it, you're going to be penalized. So it has literally become the language of revolution has become the language of the law. One could even say the same of historic preservation, which begins, of course, as probably within the school, one of the strongest forms of social activism, again in exactly the same period. 1968 is the formation of the historic preservation program in the school, and now most professional architects will make their encounter with preservation as an encounter with the law, with the voice of the law, with the sound of the law. In fact, the only graduates of this school that have the law on their side are the preservationists. So I do advise my young students to develop abilities to develop friendships with the historic preservationists, or at least to simulate such friendships. And of course, the simulation of friendship is an art form. It might even be the real art form of the architect, to produce a sort of simulation of friendship, the kind of sense of hospitality. After all, this building behind us here, which I noticed that almost nobody, in fact, nobody had a negative thing to say about it in the whole day. And is that because it is a sort of warm building or a nurturing building? No, it's terrible. I was shocked to see Andrew show us how there was this very, very elegant, almost elliptical lobby, which was then cut off in half to produce what has to be the single, that's probably, the entrance space to our building is probably smaller than is legally allowable in a private house. And this is a house for 750 students, and of course the sort of meanness of that entrance, which forces you almost instantly into a decision to the library, to the classroom downstairs. This sort of urgent decision making that it forces on you, with the smokers on one side of you and the librarians on the other. This kind of sort of time is of the essence. In no way reduces people's affection for the building. On the contrary, it seems to be very much the sort of lack of hospitality is what people think of as a kind of hospitality, in the sense of it's really tough in there. It's dense, and we never sleep, and we never eat, and everything is a nightmare. And then the moment you graduate, infinite nostalgia for this, which is either a tribute to the sort of masochism of the sort of, and it is a question: do you have to be masochist to become an architect, or do we teach you how to enjoy that? Or it's a version of the Stockholm syndrome, that we keep the students inside the building just long enough that they love to be mistreated this way. But nevertheless, this school would be unthinkable outside the building. I think all of us would have the view that were we not in this building, we simply would not be able to think the way we do. So the nature of the hospitality is not a warm couch or a soft space or even a friendly teacher. It is that classic kind of New York condition that to be anywhere else would be so completely boring, that you had to be here, because if you were here, you would virally be infected by something else that was going on around you. Students don't leave this building because New York itself is not dense enough, it's not busy enough, it's not crazy enough, and it's going to sleep too much. You stay in here for that kind of energy. And this is but trying to get back to my point, what was theorized as a possible trajectory of the world in the 60s is to a very great extent the real-time condition of the world that we live in today. It is even the law of today. It is even the establishment of today. Computation is not a new technique that could be liberating new forms of design or new forms of manipulative social control. It is already both of those things. Fully. In fact, could you imagine social control these days which doesn't involve some form of computation in a kind of almost big brotherish sense? Likewise, could you imagine revolution outside of that very same technology? One has only to think of the role Facebook played in the Arab Spring, which on the one hand you have a vast social movement liberated by a seemingly liberating technology, but that technology actually being in the hands of one of the largest monopolies the world has ever seen. There has never been so much private information in the hands of and legally owned by a single corporation. So that is to say, Facebook is the very model of possible liberatory social acts and of absolute domination and manipulation of each and every user of that source, such that Facebook is both the perfect image of statement of individual rights as experienced by a new generation and absolute domination of those rights. One can say the same things about all these other areas of ecology, technology, computation, social justice, and resources, and so on. And of course, at the time in the 1960s, there were major architectural projects engaged with these issues. One thinks, for example, of Doxiadis' literally City of the Future project, running through almost 2 decades of research, which took all of those issues as major drivers of a city of the future, which was understood to be urgently necessary, given the fact that the megalopoli were upon us, were literally upon us. And as you well know, the east coast of the United States being the corridor from Boston to Washington, to be understood as the beginning of what the world would start to look like. Of course, what's happened now is that the world does look like that. It's just that the United States and Western Europe are no longer at all at the center of this demographic tsunami. So if you ask me the question, well, what is the possible future of schools of architecture? I think we have to consider the possibility that the schools have been somewhat hampered by a new form of what might be understood to be sort of realism. That is to say, you have a significant proportion of a new generation of architects who identify their practice with a kind of efficient exercise of what spaces exist within contemporary technologies and so on. That is to say, the ecology, technology, computation, social justice, resources, and so on are addressed in the language of realism. Like, this is what the world really wants. This is what we can really deliver. I can produce for you a building that uses half the energy of a different building. I'm obviously the person that should be engaged. And I suppose I would be calling for the return to a different aspect of the 1960s, which is precisely not the realism, but more the surrealism, or at least the desire. That's to say, there would be, let's say, the call for an equally relentless imagination about the possible future. Why? Because the city of our grandchildren, that is to say, the city of the 2050, let's say 2 generations from now, the world will have about 9.3 billion people, 70% of which will be living in cities, and absolutely nobody has any idea what that means. Nobody. And, megacities have been, we've been working on that since the 1960s, and nobody knows really what it means. 7 billion people to be living in cities, 2 billion of whom will be over the age of 60. And as you know, as you get older, architecture is more and more essential to your survival. Architecture is a part of your body as you get older, in the same way that it's a part of your body when you're a child. And the sort of middle zone, you can take a certain distance from architecture and you'll live, but relatively minor drop of temperature will kill a child and will kill an old person. Therefore, the city of the future, a city in which people are tending towards a 100-year lifespan, cannot be a city that in any way resembles the city of today. And the density of this city of the future is unlike a density we have known. In no paradigms, Hong Kong, I think, is the densest place in the world. That's still no longer adequate. And I think that the possible position to take is that most people, when thinking about the city of the future, which is just tomorrow, or a little bit day after tomorrow, they see it as a series of absolutely unmanageable trends in transportation, poverty, uneven distribution of resources, and so on and so on. But there would be an argument that would say, well, actually, what if we argued it the other way around, that cities are just the single best human invention ever, and there's a reason why cities are exploding in size, why people are moving to cities, and it's not an illusion. Cities have extraordinary properties, and we will have more of that in 2050. And the fact that we'll have more of this remarkable asset makes it almost urgent for us to identify what is it about cities that we would like to maximize in the year 2050, rather than to treat the city as a set of problems that we will try to somewhat naively counter. That is to say, to return in a sense to that 1960s position of trying to imagine potential cities, not with a kind of naive view that with a beautiful set of renderings one could, as it were, change the world, but one could articulate a series of concerns or points of emphasis or desires about the possible city of the future. And it seems to me architects are at their best when trying to, as it were, capture ambitions for a better society. It is the reason that architecture students and faculty put up with basically a somewhat pathetic existence. I mean, to be trained as an architect is to relatively quickly lose the ability to really fully connect with the human species. I mean, genetically you still have a relationship. You can't mate with them. You can talk with them. You will not have weekends. You will never retire. Oscar Niemeyer, I think, turns 105 this year, and he celebrated his last birthday with a new museum and a new city. Why is this? Because there is this thought, this deep belief amongst architects, planners, preservationists, and so on, that small changes of the built environment can elevate social ambition, can represent and elevate, can make you think differently. And if you could think differently, even for a moment, you might dream differently. And if you would dream differently, you might ultimately end up in a different society. So in other words, the purpose of imagining, let's say, what might be called an extreme city, like extreme snowboarding or extreme sports. Like if a city was to have a really good time, what would it do? While that might seem frivolous and romantic, it could be the serious work of architects to identify what are the astonishing characteristics of cities that are enormously critical to the enhancement of our shared world. And I think that again and again today, while nobody could say what they liked about this building, although everybody said not just that they liked it, but they loved it, more or less, it was easily said and repeatedly said how astonishing is the campus in which this building sits. So in other words, it is precisely a kind of urban argument that comes easily and comes well. And so I do think it is, let's say, the responsibility and the magnificent opportunity for a school to try to do its best to, as it were, imagine what urban hospitality would be in the future. And simply this presents us, just to finish with a couple of very kind of precise questions, because one of the things that's back now that was raised so strongly in the 60s is the whole idea of distance learning and the idea of a distributed university and the idea of one thinks of Cedric Price and the Potteries Think Build and the attempt to imagine what would be the way that we would share knowledge in the future? And we know for sure, can I say this? We know for sure that the city of the future simply will not care about the difference between disciplines within the university. Like it will be absolutely uninterested in anybody that wants to dwell upon the difference between the architect and the engineer, scientist, artist, and so on. It's very unlikely to have any interest in the difference between academic and professional. And the figure of the academic who could not be in a deep dialogue with the so-called professional will not be able to contribute to this debate. The city of the future will not care about the difference between industry and academy, and will just as easily find its inspiration in the work of a scientist in some obscure company as in a writer in the university. In many ways, some corporations today operate more like we think of universities than universities do, and universities, as you well know, are corporations. Legally, they are corporations, are highly capitalized global corporations. There are many corporations that act in a less corporate way than universities. The city of the future won't care about that, nor will the city of the future care about your age, because surely in a city of the future where the age bandwidth is so broadened, one cannot imagine that the model will be childhood followed by education, followed by work, followed by retirement, followed by death, with, by the way, almost exactly the same furniture at each end, a kind of cot at the beginning and a cot at the end, and a kind of relief from architectural responsibility through the whole working life. Precisely the meltdown in the European economy is a meltdown of a social contract to those who retire. It's not a straightforward fiscal crisis. It's precisely a social crisis about age. And this is a crisis that will be for all of us. So surely in the future, one will have to imagine that the transgenerational capacity of cities, the contribution of the very young, the very old, one wouldn't imagine education as being locked into a particular age group. One wouldn't imagine work being a kind of a specific zone. Again, nothing I'm saying now you would not have heard in the 1960s again as a kind of proposition, but no longer is a proposition. This demographic tsunami, it's doing its thing in front of us. But distance learning is now right back in front of us, and universities all around the world are entering into this in a very, very large way. And it's very connected to what Carole was speaking about in terms of the transformation of the digital access and so on. And I think very, very connected also to the issues that Bernard is raising. And the question for us then is, what would be the relationship between this nuclear reactor model of Avery Hall, which is hyperdensity, brilliant people from all over the world coming to this sort of immigrant community to share ambitions and ideas in a very unpredictable parallel processing way. What's the relationship between this, which is a deeply architectural fantasy about the ability of a building to host creative, uplifting and professionally advanced and scientifically advanced debate, and whatever people think is about to happen with distance learning? And how could we, if the United States and Western Europe will be, as it were, spectators to this enormous transformation, how would we be enlightened spectators? In which way would the great archives of Avery, the fact that the Frank Lloyd Wright archive is, I'm so proud to say, here at Columbia now, how will this enable us to, as it were, participate in this transformation that's much more happening in Africa, Latin America, China, Middle East, and so on? And I think that means that probably we have to take very seriously the fact that universities are evolving less rapidly than cities. And if basically a university is a stupidity reduction machine, and it just tries to minimize as much as possible stupid thoughts, then a school of architecture attempts to reduce stupidity about cities. And this school was formed in 1881 when America was 28% urbanized, having been 15% urbanized just 40 years before, but already by 1920, 40 years later, America was 50% urbanized, but now the world is 50% urbanized. If Columbia said in 1881, we need a division devoted to reducing stupidity about cities, now that and this is a global university, a global research university, what kind of school of architecture and what kind of architecture does that school have to have that will enable it to answer that question as brilliantly as the school has done over the last 100 years? And I think it will involve some hybrid of the nuclear reactor model that Avery has in a certain sense perfected, and some kind of model of distributed intelligence. And just to sort of finish on an embarrassing note, well, more embarrassing than what I said before, I mean, you really have to think seriously about kids using iPads at the age of 1 and 2. I mean, I really think, that is to say, they use the iPad before they use the toilet. Getting back to the sanitary engineering roots of the school, that is to say, for them, input-output issues are electronic first, and bodily second. And when they learn how to use the toilet, it will be with an iPhone app, of course. Ding, well done. For that generation, you see the world of distributed intelligence, and the world as a world, like no longer simply the world seen from a satellite, but the embedded global world in which they're at. They will have capacities to think these questions that I'm asking in much more radical ways than we can. But I would say that our students, who are already geriatric in relationship to that, I mean, they are still our students are still the generation for whom electronics arrives after something else. But now you have the generation for whom electronics comes first. The question then is, what do we do with the school over the next 10 or 15 years to, as it were, transition into that space? And I'm making one point sort of again and again and again, which I feel that there would be enormous value to a kind of 1960s type radical testing of hypotheses about potential futures at the urban scale. That is to say, cities of the future. We didn't start to do that work yet. Were we to do that work, we could not do it as one school alone. It would be some kind of collaborative act, nor would it be a collaborative act simply with other schools. It seems to me it would involve industry and social activists, but also you'd have to go heavily into the development world as well to construct new kinds of density that would be similar to the kinds of density that people have experienced in this building, but they would be experienced, let's say, in different ways. I'm of the view, for what it's worth, that if you're having a good fish in Istanbul on Bosphorus, and somebody asks you what the future of the city is, then that's one of the cities changing the most rapidly in the world. But if you're sitting there with that good fish, and at the end of a nice meal, and you're starting to think about the future of the city, you're going to have a very different thought than you will hear in New York. I think we have to embrace the specificity of individual locations in individual situations responding differently to this evolution. At the very same time, we embrace the global interconnectivity. And finding the balance, finding the negotiation of those two things is the real challenge. The way this school did it in the past was essentially to invite the world in. So basically, this school is an island inside an island, and it's just not clear to me whether Manhattan maintains a constant relationship to New York. And in the past, if you would say to Manhattan, you can go home now, it will go back to Europe, right? But if you say to Manhattan now, time to go home, it goes to quite a few places, and Europe's not necessarily one of those. So I think we have to, I don't have like a plan, right? I'm just saying, there's a huge issue here as to what would constitute the dream of an architecture school of the future that would have the capacity to think about the city of the future. And I don't think we have it yet, but I would like to think we have pushed this technology, which is Avery Hall, right to its max. And then the question is, how can we make that same model super productive and super generative in the future? And in this, I want to, as it were, thank Bernard, because it seemed to me the key transformation that Bernard did, which is in a way, I suppose, picking up some of Alvin's experiment with a global school in London, was to sort of take the William Ware moment where America wanted to benefit from Europe but then develop a fully American ecology, including its own textbooks and so on. I mean, essentially, Bernard, in my view, put the school in the place in which it could then, as it were, decide to play a global role. And I think we're now in a position to make that move, or to put it another way, the teachers of the future and so on will do that. Anyway, probably I spoke too long, but this seems to me the dilemma. I have no idea what happens next. Other than listening to your questions. Yeah.
One has to understand that it's clear that the McKim, Mead and White campus was created removing the idea of the United States imperialism. It was an institution created to serve the new empire of the United States. And that unfortunately retains a curriculum of Columbia University, even of the School of Architecture. Today, one hears speak of the global. And unfortunately, there's a confusion of the sense of the global with the universality of humanity, which is in fact planetary, diverse, and by necessity, diverse by necessity because that's the only real democracy that there is, because there are many peoples in the world. And the globalization, which excludes most of humanity and leaves them in a place where they don't even seem to have a sense of their own history. So I would ask you, how does one avoid co-optation? You spoke of 68, of the questioning that came in 68, which was a great rebellion against that imperial moment in the world, and the need to, how that's being incorporated into the architectural profession, which in a sense has been a process of co-optation of that spirit. And of the need today to look back at that institutionalized co-optation of rebellion as being a source in itself. For instance, during your talk, you were talking about how Facebook enabled contestation in the Arab world, enabled revolution, and at the same time, it intrinsically is a device which is the most big brother element known to humanity. You know? And that phenomenon is not unique to Facebook. It's also present in the thought patterns, in every single instance in which the architectural profession works. It's certainly present here, I'm sorry to say. How does one avoid co-optation? How does one make that part of the future architectural education? Because it's not so much of the form, because one could be a modernist in form, one could be apparently revolutionary in form, but the content can be completely co-opted.
I mean, if what I said before was right, and then I should fight with you, because that would be the perfect demonstration of. But I think seriously, you firstly have to listen, and what you just said was not a good example of listening, because I never, I think, used the word globalization, and precisely I warned that I think the last 10, 15 years have been there's been an entire generation of architects who, in the name of realism, have, as it were, played along, which I would take to be the co-opting model. So I really think, but in a sense, I don't want to fight with you, because it would be, it would take relish any challenge for us to work more strongly and more seriously. But I think you really have to take the work of specific faculty and specific students and look at how it's going before one speaks sort of generally, as if, unfortunately, in the school there's a co-opting going on. I really do. I think you have to really look at the work. And an ability to make those kinds of comments without looking at the work is more dangerous to me than even work that could be criticized for those reasons. But I'm not trying to fight in the sense that, of course, you speak with the spirit that I'm looking for. And precisely when I say I'm not sure where things are going, is precisely I don't offer a heroic, I certainly don't hold myself up as the person who has that vision that we're talking about. I precisely try to say I think there is a generation in the school right now. For example, when I was a student, you could be beautiful or ethical. You couldn't be both. I mean, I'm not the 60s. I'm a little bit later, you see. And I know the 60s you could be both. If I was socially or technologically or ecologically responsible in my architecture, its ugliness would be a demonstration of that fact. for the students today, the word compromise is absolutely, just doesn't come up. They really believe in the ability of architects to be dedicated to social justice, energy efficient, shared use of responsibilities and resources, creative, beautiful, successful. They have their NGOs. It's a very different generation. So you have, in a way, a kind of generation of students that I'm very reluctant, and they're coming from every country on the planet. I'm very reluctant to disparage this level of ambition that they have. I mean, I really think this is a generation that in every way honors the radicalism of the 60s. They do so without any sense of heroism or anything. They just simply think this is their, as it were, responsibility. When you teach in a school filled with such people and faculty who pretty much feel the same way, you at a certain point have the feeling that something great is about to happen in the field. That's the feeling I have. So I find your shots good and strong, but I like to think they're killing off the people slightly behind, or a moment behind. But I welcome the caution.
What's the future of suburbia, both as a concept and a physical manifestation?
There was a question for Bernard.
Just as we're talking about the fact that we are becoming increasingly urbanized, I think it's quite, ironical to see to which extent a suburban mode of life is, what we are going to even to put back on the map, because I think that goes, but that disappears. Let me give you an example. Mark, in his talk, covered a lot of territory, including the one that really struck me about the kids that use the iPad before anything else, right? That brings us to a sort of psychoanalysis of our activity, of what we do as architect. And you brought another thing, which is that architecture is something we are deeply dependent upon, whether we are extremely young or rather old. In between, we can manage camping anytime. By this, I tend to mean that we invent the cities we are in. Mm-hmm. They are construction of the minds that are somehow altered, qualified by, of course, new technologies, changes in demographic trends, etc. But they are nevertheless invention of the minds. You remember all the famous book by Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities, where a series of cities are being described and one is not quite sure whether they are really the cities that the explorer has visited, or whether the explorer never left his house, his home, Venice, and is simply describing that particular town. To me, for example, I come back to the beginning of my little talk a minute ago, that series of charts at the top of the staircase are an amazing way to conceptualize a way to look at what we are doing at the moment. What is, if before that chart was up there, I'm pretty sure nobody knew what was going on really. Mm-hmm. And suddenly by showing it, just